You'd been at Heathrow a few times before you ended up there.
Once before, at a touring appeal.
And what was your? You were promoted to go to Heathrow, were you?
Well, I was promoted and became unattached and eventually ended up at Heathrow after being on the road again to one of these destinations I've been talking to you about. But eventually I got to Heathrow as a preventive officer first and second as a landing officer, landing and excise officer, which is the same rank as a higher executive officer in the civil service. Higher executive officer, yeah, that's right.
And what was the job involved doing that?
Landing and shipping at Heathrow Airport, just dealing with the cargo coming in, making sure that all the goods were entered and that they were valued correctly and that the duty was correct and that the money was paid. That was their job. Of course, they looked after the sheds. Each airline had a shed, a transit shed, which was covered by a bond paid by the airlines. We allowed them to store goods straight from the aircraft into that shed without paying duty. Normally you pay it when you come off the aircraft. They could store the goods in these huge sheds, like aircraft hangars and bigger, without paying the duty, on condition that they took out a bond. If anything goes missing, we'll pay the duty. And they'd sit there until the goods were entered on paper or computer eventually, and then the duty was paid or the prohibition or restriction was sorted out, and then they'd be delivered from the shed. That was the essence of their work, really, and the essence of my problems when I was a surveyor, the transit sheds, because the warehousemen and the transit sheds knew everything. They knew all of us, knew our procedures, knew everything, and they could blind us with science. They could push. Well, some of the British Airways warehousemen used to boast. Well, we were told by the investigation division, they were heard in London pubs boasting that they could steal anything or smuggle anything at Heathrow, and that's why I took great notice of the transit jets leading to a seizure of an aircraft. That's another story. Is that clear?
Yeah. So yeah, a surveyor. Was that you?
That as a landing and shipping officer, which is higher executive officer. A surveyor was a senior executive officer. But surveyor is an old customs word from hundreds of years ago. But it's the same rank as a senior executive officer in the civil service. And he was in charge of quite a large unit. I was in Heathrow in charge of about 80 people doing clerical work in the custom house. Then I was posted to Terminal 3. No terminals 4 or 5 then, so it was the terminal of the country. All the rich people, celebrities, smugglers all came through Terminal 3, famous throughout the world really. And I went there from the custom house as a surveyor, senior executive officer, in charge of Terminal 3, which had about 100 staff altogether, I suppose. Assistant officers, executive officers, senior officers.
And so you were promoted to surveyor while at Heathrow then?
Yeah, yes. And I was not prepared to go on the run again, on the unattached again. So I said, I'll take the interview. If I get it, I'll stay at Heathrow. And if I can't stay at Heathrow, I won't take promotion. But there was one job in the custom house available. Nobody wanted that. It was clerical, you see. So I took it to stay at Heathrow. But within a year or so, I was moved out to somewhere more active, an active person. And I went to Terminal 3. I was there for 2 or 3 years, I think. A very hectic time. Very hectic. We had the first customs and excise strikes there. Of course, we had the first swallows and stuffers at Terminal 3.
So you were starting to get a problem with people hiding drugs then?
Oh yeah,
in their bodies, and
yeah. Normally they'd hide the goods in the cases, double bottom cases, that sort of thing. But then all of a sudden, a new way of smuggling started, and swallows and stuffers we call them. Swallows used to put heroin or cocaine into condoms. They'd be tied up in a little ball, and they'd swallow them. The most swallowed was 30 30.
30.
30 condoms full of cocaine or heroin. 30 was swallowed. He was ill, of course, taken to hospital. But 30 was the record. Usually half a dozen.
So that fellow survived, did he?
Yeah, he survived in the end, but they had to pump his stomach out. And the stuffers were the ones that stuffed him up the bottoms. He couldn't get an awful lot up there, but they got enough. If it's heroin or cocaine, there's a few £1,000s worth you could get up there. And of course, the job was finding it, because you can only detain a person for so long without evidence. We didn't have evidence. He couldn't stop them. We thought, oh, he's a swallower. He's got that look about him. You could detain him for so long, and then you'd have to let him go. So what we did, we put them into, well, how can I start?
So first, how did you know about this problem in the first place?
I don't know. It started just before I went to Heathrow, but obviously the investigation division got information about it, and we found that this was happening, and so we started to look for it. And when we started to look for it, it was there, in smaller quantities at first, but then it blossomed because it was an easy way to get through. Because you can't stick your finger up somebody's bottom to say, "Have you got anything there?" You've got to have reasonable grounds for doing it. And if you don't have reasonable grounds, it's an assault. If he's got nothing there, so you had to have reason, and that was our big problem: having reason to detain a man until they passed through. That was the biggest job.
So you didn't do the latex glove method then? You just detain them.
We do. For the bottom one, we do the latex gloves. Yeah, as you see on films. Yeah, we do that. But you still had to have reasonable grounds for doing it. Couldn't do it to anybody. It was an assault. So you had to have reasonable grounds. Could have been information from the investigation division, or perhaps you'd found something on him, a little bit of hash on him. That was enough to do it, Or you just suspected him, and you'd try and keep him around as long as possible, in the hope that he'd come and you'd have to go to the toilet, because very often they had to go to the toilet, when stuffed up there. They couldn't wait too long.
And for the swallowers, would you just have to wait until it passed through them?
Yes. There was no way of telling at first, but then the scientists devised a test on urine which gave an indication there was some drugs in the blood. They all leaked, all these condoms leaked slightly. Not a very comforting thought, is it? But they used to leak slightly. And in their urine, the slightest indication, and that was enough to say, to detain them for a while and ask them if they got anything inside them. And if they said no, we say, but we've got this indication, and we're going to keep you for a while. And that's when we put them in a separate room. But if they refused to give a urine sample, well, that was a reason for detaining them anyway. What have you got to fear? It was a lot of cut and thrust, a lot of bluff, Eventually, we became very professional, but in the early days, we were amateurish, very amateurish. And if we had a person we thought had stuff inside them, we'd take them to the toilets and we'd sort of wait until they came through, which was useless. So we had to build what's called a special interview room.
So how did that come about then, this first special interview room?
Well, because we had, in the toilets, we had like a sluice, and the officers, there was a special group of officers who dealt with swallowers and tubbers. Not everybody who would like it, would deal with it, and we didn't force them to. But there was a special group, a special unit, and they were done sort of coats and have masks and gloves, and they would go into the toilet of these people and sit with them in hope that it would come through, But that was no good, of course. When it came through them, it was a right mess, a real mess. And they had to then sift through the mess, which was nonsense. So quickly and hurriedly, we built a little room for them. And I built it. I had it built. I asked the Home Office to give me money towards it. They said, no, it's your job, that. I told you about that before. It's customs job, that. So I approached BAA, British Airports Authority, and they were very helpful. Well, I knew them personally, I went to parties with them. and they gave me £70,000, and I built this special interview room. I had it built, and one of my officers saw on television a new type of automatic toilet built in Sweden for building sites, whereby you could sit on the toilet, make a mess into a plastic bag, which would then automatically hermetically seal electrically. So when the officers were looking for the stuff, it was inside a plastic bag and quite safe, you know. So I saw this officers saw this on television, and I had a look at it. I came on again, and so I phoned the board and said, "Can we have one of these?" You know. So immediately said yes. So we got one in, and it was a boon. It was the basis for all interview rooms over the world. Eventually, we sat this thing down here. The man would sit on it, and it would come through. Of course, all be sealed up hermetically, and the officers. But of course, in those days when they built the first room, we weren't allowed to have a window to look at them. You know, it wasn't allowed. Nowadays, it doesn't matter. You have men look at the men, women watching the women. So he was locked in this room. We didn't know when it was coming through. You see, so we just go in and examine the bloody toilet, and then come out again, lock the door. We couldn't see what they were doing. So what they used to do, he used to come through them. They used to hide it in my wonderful special interview room. One climbed on the bed, put the bed on its side, and of course the roof was just the ordinary slats of an ordinary
ordinary sort of foam, not foam, but...
No, it was these plastic slats. You lift them up, or metal. You can lift them and get into the top. And he'd lift them up. They'd lift them up and put the stuff inside and then lay it down. And then, you know, we could go in there and there was nothing. And then another one, of course, slit the mattress and stuffed it inside the mattress. Another one, the walls are melamine, and there's about half an inch back gap at the bottom. Another one stuffed them under the gap. And then the best one of all was the toilet had tubes on the chair. Of course, he lifted the chair up, and the tubes were hollow, and they stuck them inside the tubes. So we scratched our head and said,
These were like chair legs, were they?
Chair legs, hollow tubes, yeah. So we got wise to it eventually. I mean, nowadays, they have a window and they watch them. We weren't allowed to. And so whenever we went in, we'd have to search the place. You know? But of course, we had something put across the ceiling. We had the bottom of the walls done up, and we knew to look in the mattress, and we stuffed up the chair legs. So gradually, bit by bit, we made it safe. But then, of course, it was very experimental. And just after I left, they got the money to build brick-built ones. State-of-the-art sort of stuff. Officers sitting there looking through the window at them. It's become so widespread by then. Even though we caught a lot of people, they were still coming through in their droves. You know, because it takes such a lot of time. Okay, you've got all these marvellous things. You've got to sit and wait. Some of them hold it for 24 hours, you know. And then they get a lawyer in and say, what are you doing with him? And, no idea.
So is this the first specialised room for this purpose in
the world? In the world, absolutely, yeah. I'm glad people didn't come from over the world to look at the first one I built. It was bloody rubbish.
Oh, so you didn't get people coming to look at your room and take it?
No. Well, we did show some of them, but we weren't very proud of it. But they'll come now. When they built the brick-built ones, they came to see, of course. I had visitors from all over the world at Terminal 3. They took a lot of my time up, actually. There was nothing to show in the interview room. It wasn't. It was insecure, really. But it was the best part was when the officer saw that on the television. He saw that special Swedish toilet. That was a lifesaver, absolute lifesaver. The officers didn't get dirty and didn't all this smell and stuff. It was inside a plastic bag. You could see it. Mind you, you'd have to cut it. If you had something, you had to cut it open and get it out.
So you had people coming to look at your procedures for other procedures as well, did you?
Oh yeah, I had many people coming to look at what we were doing, yeah. Yeah.
And of course you were asked by the Americans to go over and...
Oh yeah, that's nothing to do with drugs. Well, it was in a way. on your side. When everybody knows about the courier service now. In my day, in Terminal 3, it had just started, and I these American courier companies, people that looked like these religious sects people, huge people in blue suits coming over to me, trying to make me let their courier stuff through quickly. We used to have to make them go through the red channel, you see, because courier stuff is not passengers' baggage. Courier stuff is cargo, and cargo should go through the cargo terminal, which is much longer than walking through. They didn't want to go through the cargo terminal. They didn't want to go through the cargo. They wanted to come through the red channel and pay any duty there and go off quickly. And I wanted them to go through cargo, and that was a great fight. That was a great fight one time. But my boss said, the top collector said to me, we're in a lot of trouble with these couriers, aren't we? I said, yeah, I want them to go to the cargo terminal. And he said, yeah, not so sure. I think they're getting onto headquarters. I think they'll probably be able to go there in the end. I said, oh, build a new separate facility, which would happen. He said, I know. Go across to America, because they were American firms, and have a look, see what they're doing. And the Pan American manager said told the collector, you're having an inaugural flight to New York, a new flight, new aircraft or something. And they would take me across free of charge and let me look at this system in New York. And by the way, he says, Mr. Savile can fly anywhere in America, free of charge, have a holiday there, then fly to New York with us and deal with the courier situation there. So I'd had a hard time with the strikes that had gone on, and the collector, so smashing man, said, I think you deserve a holiday, Norman. I've got permission from the board. You know, you can go over and take your wife and have a holiday and do this at the same time. Most unusual, but it was authorised at a high level. So, of course, Mavis and I went across, first class, down to Miami, and stayed in Miami a week. Flew up to New York, and I stayed in a hotel near the airport, one of the well-known ones, and I went to the airport. No, an agent, customs agent, came to the hotel and picked me up, and he said, "What are you doing in this hotel?" I said, "Got my wife here." "Oh my God," he said, "this isn't the best place for your wife. It's in a bad area, you know." "Oh," he said, "bloody dead dog outside there, you know. She shouldn't be here." I said, "Well, we're here now." He said, "Well, yeah, I'll take you around, show you around the airport and the courier business. Tell your wife to stay locked in her room." So I said, "Stay locked in your room." She went, "Huh?" So she stayed locked in her room. And I went to the airport, shown round. The agent said that he'd a gun in his sock. You know, they carry guns there at the airport. And whenever anybody came through, that's what they do now, they keyed you in, and if you were wanted for anything in anywhere in the United States, you'd be found there. But anyway, I went to look at their courier service, and they didn't know as much as I did. They were asking me, "What do you do?" They had the same problems, and exactly the same. They were going through the red channel, and yet they wanted them to go through the cargo terminal, and the courier companies being big business. "No, we don't want to go in the cargo terminal." And they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I've got to find out what you do." And that was that. And we flew back, of course. We had to go to Paris and across. But anyway, we flew back. Mavis was, we were in the VIP lounge in New York waiting to take off. There was a delay through some strikes or other. And the agents had come to see me off, and there were three of them. And I said, "Well, I'm going into the VIP lounge now. Would you like to come with me?" "Oh, yeah," they said. They came and met Mavis, and they entertained her for an hour while I was sorting our flights out. And, of course, they were all drinking free stuff, you know. I invited them over to London, but they never came. But I got back and said, "Sorry, boss, I can't tell you anything. They're asking us." Anyway, the upshot of it, eventually, they built a separate facility in the passenger area. Not passengers, not cargo. And that's what happens to courier baggage now.
Yeah. You said there was a lot of strikes when you were there.
The customs went on strike, yeah. Because Mrs. Thatcher was in power, and she cut down. Well, she wouldn't allow any increase in pay or minor increase in pay, because she gave big increases to police because they were knocking the workers at the time, and they got huge increases, like 6-7%. We got 0.5%. So the staff went on strike. Not all of them went, and didn't last long, but it was difficult because we didn't want any drugs to get through, and yet there was no staff there. And of course, anybody who wanted to pay duty had to put a declaration in a box, and I had to have it sorted out when the strike was over. So it was a pretty hectic time for me, really, with all these new swallows and stuffers and things.
And you had to keep things going despite the fact that the people were striking.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I had to supervise the red channel. A few officers stayed on, of course, but everybody was walking through the green. Oh, I'm not declaring anything, but there were documents there they could fill in a declaration, put it in a box, and later on we asked them for the duty, you know. But of course, you imagine some of the comments on the papers they put in there. Get stuffed. You know, I've got so-and-so, so-and-so, ha, ha, all that sort of thing. And a lot of people declared stuff. I had to send to them. I had about 4 clerks working on it for a week. Because a lot of people did declare stuff. But it was a bit hectic, Terminal 3. But then their job came up in a special inquiry unit called Station 25 in the cargo terminal. It was a plum job. You could pick your own officers. You didn't do any routine work at all. You had drug dogs. Shall I carry on with that?
Yeah, you
Left Terminal 3 after 3 years, I think.
left, and that was leaving the airport? Or
No, across to the cargo terminal from the passenger area to the cargo terminal.
Yeah, and that's when you got drug dogs, was it?
Drug dogs in the cargo terminal in Station 25.
And you used that to use those dogs presumably to go around the warehouses to...
Yeah, sniffing the cargo. And we took them, well, started off with 2 dogs when I got there. I'll explain. It's a special inquiry unit. It had 4 teams, 4 senior officers, 2 teams with drugs and prohibitions, though they could do other work, and 2 teams were looking for revenue smuggling duty, you know, underpaid duty, and prohibitions and restrictions, really. So 2 separate units, although they did work together occasionally. One was mainly drugs, one was mainly revenue. And in the middle we had 2 drug dogs and 2 dog handlers, which one of the senior officers looked after. One of the senior officers in charge of a team looked after the dog handling unit. And there were 2 dogs. By the time I left, 8 years later, there were 6 dogs, 6, 8 years. But as you say, the dogs used to go around cargo terminals, sniff out the various things, drugs. And then when I got more than 2 dogs, I sent them to the central area, and they go along the baggage before the baggage went into the hall. If they sniffed anything, of course, if they could get in and have a quick look, they would. If not, they let it run till it was picked up. And then they picked the man up at the door. So they wouldn't, no use looking at it first because the man wouldn't collect it. No, you know, if he thought you'd looked at it, he wouldn't collect it. So he'd let it run and catch them at the door with it. So the dogs are quite well known. As I say, I used to go every year to the RAF dog training unit in Nottingham. They trained our dogs. There again, I stayed in the officers' mess for 3 nights. Very nice.
You had a visit from the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher,
yes,
to the dog unit.
It wasn't just the dog unit. She came to look at the drug problem. She was going to do Helenol. In the end, she cut the staff. Anyway, she came in, and I was asked, because I was in charge of this special unit, did nothing but inquiries and anti-smuggling. Will you show Mrs. Thatcher around the British Caledonian shed, which is British Airways, really? And I said, oh, I hate the woman. I don't. And the collector said, that's an order. You will do it. I didn't want to. Couldn't stand the woman. So anyway, I had to go there with my senior officer, Dave Buckley, and I had to go into British Caledonian shed. I was standing there waiting for her to come in, and she came in and said, little woman, tiny, so small, with dandruff all over her coat, and piercing blue eyes, And of course, she knew how to charm people. Oh, the warehouseman was standing round, labour to a man, I suppose, but they all clapped her. You know, she smiled at them, nodding away, and then she had these piercing blue eyes looking at me, you know. And I showed her around the shed, the various things we had in the shed, what we were looking at, how we did it. And then I said, we'll give you a drug dog demonstration. Oh, good, good, she said. So we stood at one end of the shed, and I said, this young lady will come in with a black Labrador. We've hidden some drugs in some of the cargo. We hope the dog will find it. We made bloody sure he did. But we hope the dog will find it, you know. So she was standing there chatting, and in comes this red-headed girl with a black Labrador. She was in uniform, of course, and this lovely black Labrador came rolling with her. And Mrs. Thatcher, as soon as she saw that dog, she looked at the press photographers all round her. She looked at that dog, and she said, "Oh, a lovely dog." And my senior officer, Dave Buckley, said to her, "Stand back, madam. That is a working dog." And she jumped back as if he'd been shot. Now that's a lovely moment, isn't it? Who's ever told Mrs. Thatcher off and got a reply like that? Oh, a response like that. I bought him a beer after that. I thought it was smashing. She did what she was told. She jumped back and stood there, and we carried on with the demonstration, and off she went, very happy. But not many people have got away with telling her off, I tell you.
You also, what's it called? You also had another visit, didn't you?
Princess Diana.
Princess Diana, yeah.
Yeah, she came, had to show around the large British Airways shed and give her a drug dog demonstration.
Same sort of thing.
All the same sort. I was fed up to the back teeth with it. I had about one visitor a week, all over the world. I could quote names. Anyway, Mrs. Thatcher came, Princess Di came. I had to show her around the British Airways shed. Of course, the big wigs, the collector was there, deputy collector. Norman had the drug dog, so he had to do the work, you see, get the thing organised. So I went into the British Airways shed, and she was brought along, introduced to me, or I was introduced to her. It was on the news that night, it was on television. And I think you've got a newspaper cutting with a picture of me with her. And we chatted, and I told her what we did. And she wasn't interested in anything except the dogs. She didn't really interested in how we found the drugs, other than the drug dogs. So I said, we'll give you a demonstration of a drug dog. Oh, yes, please, she said. I'd love to see that. So we wandered across the cargo, and in comes this chap with Oscar, a Springer Spaniel, lovely dog. And I said, now the dog's going to look for drugs, and we've hidden the drugs in the cargo. We hope the dog will find it, you know. And so the lad, forgotten his name, sets off Oscar. Oscar goes lolloping around, sniffing everywhere, going jumping up and down. And after about, made it a good 7 or 8 minutes, of course he found this case. So he grabbed hold of the handle of the case, and I said, "Oh, it looks as if he's found something, madam." I think I called her ma'am. And so she said, oh, can we see it? So the dog had hold of this thing, and we opened the case and brought a steel container out with the drugs in it and showed it to her. Meantime, the handler was playing with the dog in this case. She said, "What's he doing?" I said, "Well, the dogs are trained by giving them play after they find something. So the dog's now found something, so the handler's got to play with him. If he doesn't, he won't do it again. So he's got to have a good play." So we watched this handler playing with this dog and trying to get this suitcase off it. He wouldn't let go. See, so I said, "Okay, that's enough. You can go now." So he couldn't get the dog off the bloody handle, you see. So another 2 officers came across and pulling. And I said, "Oh, never mind. Take him out." See, so the young officer, got the case up, slung it over his shoulder, and Oscar was hanging from it. And he stalked out the shed, and she was clapping her hands and laughing at the dog going out the shed like this. Of course, that was on the news. And it's in the newspaper cutting you've got. Of course, the secret of that was I got letters from all over the country about Oscar. Kids sent money, sellotape to envelopes, a letter from someone in Cornwall saying, "Can I make my dog with Oscar? I'll pay you a good money," and a couple of good letters from people whose children had gone down with drugs saying, "Keep up the good work," dozens of letters, and all this these coppers and silver and you know, I said, I don't know how to pay this in. We don't have a dog account, you know. So anyway, in the end, the collector said, "Oh, buy some biscuits or something." You see. So we kept a little money on the side and bought extra stuff. There were half a dozen dogs by then, plenty there. So that was very interesting, of course. But she was charming, as she always was. Everyone knew she was charming. More than I could say for Mrs. Thatcher.
So, while Thatcher and Diana were two of the most famous visitors, you had similar kind of visitors all the time, did you?
Oh, all the time. All the time. I had the police officer from Melbourne in Australia came. 'Cause, not every country had a unit like mine, whereas you picked your own officers, which is anathema to the union, and you did no routine work. You just looked for offences. It's not the investigation department. They investigated offences already found or information. We just looked for drugs and underpayments at the airport, and if it was really big or had ramifications outside the airport, it would then be handed over to the investigation division. But we're an unusual unit, and they set up more around the United Kingdom. Then, as I say, this police officer from Melbourne came. Police officer in Melbourne, police chief, he's in charge of customs there. Not in this country, but in Melbourne, he's in charge of customs. And he came, and he was very interested. He intended to set up a unit like that when he got back. Gave me a tie, and I remember saying to him, "We've got a do on at lunchtime. Somebody's leaving. I don't know whether you want to stay in the office for somebody to look after you, or you know whether you do have a drink. You know." I didn't know what to say to him. He said in his broad Australian accent, "You probably don't understand me." What do you say? "I do happen to take a tube, Norm." I do happen to take a tube, doesn't mean to drink a tin here, but I do happen to take a tube, Norm. And he came up with us and drank with us. People from all over the world, from America even. The German customs, Frankfurt customs, had units like ours, slightly different. So they invited my senior officer, Dave Buckley, the one in charge of the dogs, and myself over to Frankfurt to discuss sharing information, in fact. And so we went over there, and they treated us right royal, I can tell you. Really royally. The first day we got there, we didn't go out of the airport. They took us to a little do they were having. Somebody was leaving, would you believe? And they sent a beautiful German girl, blonde and blue-eyed, to drive us round. We had a car, she drove us round. Oh, they looked after us marvellously. They really seemed to like us. And we were sitting in this room at the airport, and they were sort of toasting the lad who was going and all that. Then they were proud of their unit, and they said, "Right, we'll have our song now." And they all stood up on the table and sang their song. And it was to "God Save the Queen." You know,
The German song?
The German song was to the music, "God Save the Queen." And he said, "We mean no disrespect, it's just a nice tune." He said. And David and I were sitting there and wondered what they're singing. We couldn't hear it, you know, it was in German. But they were very nice people. They showed us around. One of the chaps took us to a restaurant in a nice place in the evening. We invited him over, and he was going to come at one time, never made it. But as I say, it was a job of a lifetime. I was there 8 or 9 years, job of a lifetime. My own staff, could pick my own staff, my own hours, come and go as I pleased. Everything that happened at the airport of any interest I was involved in. And eventually the highlight of my career, I suppose, was seizing an aircraft, a big aircraft. Do you want me to tell you about that?
Yeah, sure. How did that come about then?
Well, I was telling you about transit sheds and the fact that warehousemen were all involved in, no, not all, were involved in smuggling, and large quantities of drugs were coming through, and we used to meet the aircraft side, make sure stuff came into the shed. We used to have the dog running on the shed looking for drugs and all that. But they were getting a lot through the sheds because of the warehousemen, because the warehousemen knew the warehousemen in the foreign countries, and they knew exactly what was coming in. They knew what shifts we were on, knew who we were, and they could shift stuff through. They could steal stuff for a start and get drugs through. And this went on for a year or so, and it was happening in the Air Canada shed, so I demanded, what do you call them, surveillance cameras. And the manager was a good friend of mine actually. He said, yes, okay. And then his boss, the central area, said no, because the warehousemen don't want them. They say we're spying on them and it'll cost too much anyway. So he said, I'm sorry, I've got to refuse. So I said, well, I shall take it further. And what I did, I built up a case against British Airways as well. I never got round to them in the end. Against the Air Canada, because there was goods going through their sheds and being smuggled, drugs were being smuggled, goods were being stolen. I listed all these things, and we knew they were being stolen because you'd have a consignment of watches come in. It would be on the manifest, so it would be on the list of what was in the shed. And you'd go to find this consignment, wasn't there, hadn't been entered for customs or duty paid, been stolen. See, or it was a sort of a fake importer who imported the drugs in, imported the watches or jewellery or whatever in. It got into the shed, but instead of him making an entry for it, he got the warehouseman to shove it through without an entry. So it wasn't just the warehouse, it was the people, the importers as well. So we had a computer system by then, and if we ever had a new importer, he was always done first, a new importer. See, that's the way we worked. We had a computer system as well. But every time we did something, they counted it, and in the end, of course, we were checking the manifests to see what was on the aircraft, then see where it was in the shed. So we always had an idea what was missing. So what did they do? They didn't put consignment on the manifest. Of course, it's completely illegal. Renders the aircraft liable to seizure. We don't know about it. No idea. It's not on the papers, not on the manifest, not on the computer. We don't know it exists. And the warehousemen in Karachi were in league with the warehousemen in Air Canada, and they shifted it on the plane without the captain knowing. Of course, he was livid when I spoke to him, because the weight was, the one we found was 330 kilos. And he said it would affect the trim of his aircraft, because he didn't know it was on. So that's what they did in the end. The final, last straw broke the camel's back. They didn't put it on the manifest. So I remember I was at home, and they phoned through to me and said, we know there are 330 kilos of drugs in this consignment in the shed. It's not on the manifest, boss. We found it at the aircraft side with dogs, you see. And they don't know we know about it. They had no idea. So we know what it is, and we're watching it, but it's not manifested. So I remember being in Old Windsor. You were in the house at the time. Your father was at the time. I was pacing up and down saying, shall I go to the airport? Shall I try and seize this plane? Never been done before. I remember your father saying to me, what's the matter with you? I told him, and he laughed and said, well, go for it, So I left all of you, I was supposed to be entertaining you, and off I went to the airport and to see what was going on. And cut a long story short, they delivered, they were watching it. The investigation division were in by that time. It was too big for us. They were watching it. It was delivered into a van, and the van was tailed by the investigation division to a pub where it stopped. And of course then the ID had a punch up with them and got these drugs, 330 kilos of hashish. That's the word I'm looking for.
The ID?
The investigation division. They're the ones who dealt with stuff outside the airport. It was too big for us, or it was going into London. They just did the investigation work. And so they had a punch up in the pub and seized this 330 kilos. So then it was a long job for me doing a report over the past 2 years, all the things that had gone wrong, the fault of Air Canada warehousemen. They wouldn't cooperate in the end. And now one of their aircraft had unmanifested drugs on board, you see. And I said, under the law, I quoted all the law, I think you read my paper, I copied the papers. The aircraft is liable to seizure, no matter what its size. With ships, there's a limit of 250 tonnes. With aircraft, they hadn't got round to it. And so this big aircraft, a TriStar it was, Air Canada's TriStar, carried hundreds of passengers, was liable to seizure. Because I couldn't seize off my own, I did this long report whilst the aircraft went around the world. We kept track of it, and my boss went to the headquarters with the report and said, you know, we wanted to seize it. And they scratched their heads a lot and don't think they liked it very much, but they did. They gave us authority to seize the aircraft. But what they said, well, don't seize it. I mean, we know you can detain it and demand a penalty of £60,000, and they can appeal then if they want to. So the aircraft came in. I had to go and do the job, of course. I went with a crew and stopped everybody coming off the aircraft. Went on board. I went to see the captain. Opened the door and see the captain. I expected trouble because they're stroppy buggers. And I told him what had happened. I said, I'm therefore detaining this aircraft and it won't be released unless you pay £60,000 and you can argue about it later. And he looked at me and he said, well, it's about time somebody did something about bloody drugs. We gobsmacked. I thought he'd argue. About time. He said, good on you. See, and off he went. So stuffed a car in front of the wheels, got a picture of it to show if you like, told the air traffic controller it wasn't to leave and demanded the money. And the top man came to see me and said, I haven't got that money in the bank here. Will you accept a cheque? I said, no way. He said, you shouldn't seize it, you see. I said, no way, I'll accept a cheque. So he went to the collector, the top man, and said, Mr. Saville won't accept a cheque, you know. Will you instruct him to accept a cheque? And Dickie Craggs said, the collector said, if Norman wants, what's it called? What do they call him? If Norman won't accept a cheque, then you have to do it in another way. And they send a sort of gram over from Canada. You'd have to send some sort of money order from Canada, which will guarantee that it'll be paid. So this fellow was furious, but because he had hundreds of passengers waiting to go on this aircraft, and he couldn't go. They're all sitting in the lounges.
This is the controller of
Air Canada. He had all these people waiting to go, and I detained the aircraft, and he couldn't go. And I wouldn't release it until I got 60,000 quid. So they mailed it over. I forgot how they did it now. But there's a word for it. They sent it over electronically to the Barclays Bank in the cargo terminal, and Barclays transferred it to customs account, and then I released it, and off it went. Of course, it was on the news that night. But they appealed, of course, went to court, thrown out, went to the High Court, thrown out, went to the House of Lords, thrown out, because the law was clear. I won't go into details now, but the law was clear, as far as I was concerned. So they took it to Europe, and it took 2 years. What they were saying was, it's unreasonable, like a judicial review sort of thing, unreasonable to expect an old law like that to cover huge passenger aircraft when the airline has no control over what's in the cargo hold. It's not our fault. It's not our passengers' fault. You know, it's just one of those things. Of course, our argument was that their responsibility was to make sure everything was on the manifest. They shouldn't have loaded it. Apart from the fact it affected the trim of the aircraft. Then when it came off, they should have entered it. And it was in the transit shed and the transit bond, not even entered. So they were culpable. And of course, it took 2 years, and the European Court backed us. So they lost their money in the end. But that law was changed pretty damn quickly, because the airlines are very powerful, and they convinced the board that it was an unreasonable law. So it was repealed. So you couldn't do it anymore. So that was probably the highlight of my career.
So was that the first and last time that a airliner was seized?
A large one. Small passenger aircraft doing smuggling runs, of course you still seize them now, but any large passenger aircraft had never been seized before, and have never been seized since.
So it's a unique event then?
It's a complete separate event, never happened before or after.